So I want to offer my deepest gratitude to the organizers of this event to give remarks at such a wonderful meeting of people who I will refer to as freedom fighters. All of us are freedom fighters in one way or another in our respective parts of the world. So I say thank you to this organizing body and good morning to all of you. I bring you greetings from the beautiful Pacific Northwest. My body is 3 hours behind us right now, so pardon me if I seem a bit lethargic or sleepy this morning. As I reflect on the title of our gathering for this World Congress, I can't help but think that there's a certain degree of tragedy associated with it. For we speak of the hope of peaceful coexistence. And if we are hoping for peaceful coexistence, that implies that at present we do not have it. And if we do not have peaceful coexistence, then how can we busy ourselves as freedom fighters with the task of achieving it? And what is it about religions across the spectrum that all proclaim peace as their fundamental principles, and yet we abide in a world where so much violence and conflict emerges from the very people who purport to be so committed to peace? As I listened to Dr. Diop go through all of the major world religions, or many of the major world religions, in his opening remarks to the session this morning, I was struck by how much there is agreement on this question of peace and how deeply committed we are to it. But I begin to wonder if the reason that we have to hope for peaceful coexistence isn't that there's something fundamentally wrong with the idea of peace, but it seems to me that there would then be something fundamentally wrong in contrast with those who proclaim it and yet do something other than that. And I can only speak from my experience. I am not from another country outside of this one. I was born and raised in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and my remarks today come to you as an African American growing up in an inner city whose conversion to Seventh-day Adventism was cemented when I took a Revelation seminar. Those of you who are Seventh-day Adventists know what I'm talking about. When I took a Revelation seminar some 26 plus years ago, and when we got to the study on Revelation 13 and America's role in Bible prophecy, which was probably about halfway through the study, I was asking about baptism. And the reason why I was asking about baptism is because our eschatological understanding of America is driven by a fundamental gulf between her proclamations and her practices. For on one hand, she would proclaim that all human beings are created equal. And yet on the other hand, that same proclamation was thoroughly undermined by the presence of enslaved Africans and the genocidal treatment of indigenous Americans. And so when I came to that doctrine and that study, what stirred so much in my spirit was that everything about my experience as an African American growing up in Philadelphia seemed to be represented in that doctrine. I couldn't help but think about all the times I would turn on the television or listen to the radio and see political leaders speak of the lofty promises of American democracy, and then walk to ghettos and through ghettos in my own community where people lived a reality that was far and away very different from the reality that was spoken of on television. I remember in 1987, the late Supreme Court Justice Thurgood Marshall created quite a scandal because on the 200th anniversary of the Constitution, he gave remarks that ran counter to the narrative of America as a freedom-loving country by making the bold, but to me, the rather obvious proclamation that the Constitution is far from perfect, and that it took a series of amendments to declare on paper what is already declared naturally. It took the 13th, the 14th, and the 15th Amendment to grant natural rights. Now think about this. Political documents are woefully inexact. And if we take God seriously, and if we take this business of liberty seriously, what we come to understand is that the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, or any other political document, they do not create rights. They recognize. And if they recognize them, then when we deprive one another of them, we are essentially attempting to take away that which God has given. And so, to me, the business of liberty and the business of religious liberty and religious freedom is deeply connected to the idea of peaceful coexistence, because the reason we have no peaceful coexistence is because despite our lofty proclamations of peace, somehow or another, we come to believe that religious freedom means the freedom of one belief system or one denomination to dominate all others. And we somehow seem to think that freedom of religion means, at least in America, I'm a Christian, so get out of my way. I'm a Christian, therefore my values matter so much more than yours. I am a Christian, therefore, despite the fact that my own creed tells me to be a doer of the word and not a hearer only, I will behave in a manner that is so inconsistent with the teachings of the Savior that it will make people scratch their head in incredulity, wondering, what exactly do you believe? And so if we have to hope for peaceful coexistence, I would urge you to consider that maybe the reason we have to hope for it is because there's a fundamental gulf between our creeds and our deeds. Dr. Martin Luther King, who was born in January, not February. I'll say that again. Dr. Martin Luther King, whose birthday is in January, not February, said that some people have a high blood pressure of creeds and an anemia of deeds. And I just want you to think about a statement he made the night before he was assassinated. You know, we celebrate the Martin Luther King of 1955 to 1963. We seem to believe, or somehow in our civil imaginations, when we make the monument to him in Washington, D.C., we seem to think that his legacy ends with the "I Have a Dream" speech. But it really doesn't, because he lives 5 more years. And in those 5 more years, he began to see that the problems of America that were so deeply connected to race were problems that he began to believe may actually be intractable. I remember him commenting in confidence, Harry Belafonte speaks of this, he says that, "I'm afraid that I may have integrated my people into a burning house." And at the end of his life, the night before he's assassinated, he makes a statement that essentially sums up the entire African American experience. He says, quote, all we say to America is be true to what you said on paper. That's it. And the work of freedom, the work of religious freedom, the work of religious liberty is the attempt to bridge the gap between the promises made on paper and the practices carried out in everyday life. And if we, as freedom fighters, can take anything away from this conference, what we ought to take away from this conference is that in many ways, religious freedom is not necessarily superior to other civil rights, but that it itself is a civil right. And as Seventh-day Adventists, if we take Revelation 13 seriously, then when John is exiled on Patmos and he beholds a nation arising out of the earth with lamb-like horns that speaks as a dragon, we will know that essentially what John is telling us is that if you want to understand the events at the end of time, you must examine the events of the beginning of the United States of America. For it is the same political and religious hypocrisy that prevailed at the founding of this nation that will prevail in abundance in the last days. And there will not be a union, an illicit union of religion and government, except that the nation has already become acquainted with the process of disregarding civil liberties. And the disregard of civil liberties as it relates to African Americans has been at full throttle since the founding of this nation. So I want you to walk away from here with a few things in mind. As you go back to the Philippines or to Africa or to Asia or to any other South America, any other continent or country around the world, I want you to know that you ought to be just as concerned about the events that unfolded in Ferguson, Missouri 3 years ago, 4 years ago, as you should be concerned about the events happening in your country. To the Americans here, I say, if we are not concerned about the political and civil rights of African Americans in this nation, we are betraying a legacy to which we are inextricably connected. Because as people who are uniquely interested in freedom, and as people who have certain biblical and theological commitments to an understanding of end times, we must never separate our religious freedom from the freedom of those who live life on the margins and who find themselves in a world where they are harassed daily by circumstances that we like to say will only happen at some distant time in the future. Because they are happening now. Charlottesville, Virginia is case in point. So now how do we rid ourselves of this disease of not practicing what we believe? I think one of the first things we have to do is we have to get to the core of the corruption. And we have to, intellectually, we have to become honest with ourselves, and we have to begin to survey the history of our religion and take it seriously. So in the context of Christianity, for example, this is the 500th anniversary of the Protestant Reformation. I've heard much about Luther tacking the 95 Theses to the door of the church at Wittenberg, but I've heard very little about Luther's anti-Semitic and racist tract, The Jews and Their Lies, published in 1543, just several years before his death. Why do I bring this up? Because it's important to understand that there really is no Third Reich, except there is a legacy and a history in German intellectual thought that's laid at the foot of the Protestant Reformation when Luther begins to separate Christianity from its Jewish roots. And as he ferrets out Judaism and labels the Jews as other and speaks of their swarthy complexions and big noses, And then you get into the 18th century, and Immanuel Kant, the German philosopher, says Judaism is not even a religion. And then by the time you get to 1939, Hitler's Germany is engaged in a project where they're telling their German theologians to do everything you can to rid Christianity of Judaism completely. And so we now stand 500 years after Luther, and if we're going to be serious about this business of freedom, about this business of peaceful coexistence, about this business of doing what God has called us to do, let us take a long, hard look in the mirror. May we be honest with ourselves, and may we leave this place knowing that peaceful coexistence is only possible if our deeds match our creeds. I want to close with this final thought by the Jewish philosopher Emmanuel Levinas. His entire family was killed in concentration camps in World War II. He said, quote, "God rises to his supreme presence according to the justice rendered among men." I believe Jesus said it this way. He used the phraseology, "the least of these." And except we leave here with a commitment to do justice, for those who are here in the Christian tradition, except we leave here with a commitment to make the word flesh, that it may dwell among us and that others may behold the glory of God through our lives insofar as we commit to this business of religious freedom. If we do not make that commitment, our living will be in vain. I pray that it will not be. God bless you. Thank you.